Hi everyone, this is Arvind from MindMajix, and today I welcome you all to this amazing video on API testing interview questions. Okay, so we are continuing with our interview series of videos. Okay, so in this topic, we will try to cover maximum questions that are most frequently asked in the interviews. Okay, and if you talk about this video, so the number of questions that we have covered here, so we have basically divided them into two categories. So the first category of questions is for freshers, and the second category of questions is for experienced folks, like those candidates who have at least 2 to 3 years of experience in testing, or you can say API testing. Okay, so that is the whole agenda of this session. I hope everyone is clear with this. Okay, so without any further delay, let's get started. Before discussing the first question, I would like to inform you, the best way to get the most out of this interview questions videos. Okay, so whenever I discuss a particular question, so what you can do is you can just read the question, you can stop the video or you can pause the video and you can recollect the answer in your mind. Okay, and after that you can again play the video, you can have a look at the answer that we are discussing over here in this video. In that way you can correlate whether you're on the right track as far as your knowledge or your preparation for that particular interview is concerned. Okay, so I hope this helps, and now let's get started with our first question. So the first question is a very basic question, as you can see. So the question says, what does API testing mean? Okay, so API, which stands for Application Programming Interface, it gives us the details regarding how some software components must act together. So in simple words, API testing is a set of procedures and functions that allow us to create applications, access data or features of an OS or an application. So all in one, testing of such procedures is acknowledged as API testing. Okay, so now let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question is, what are the names of tests that are executed on APIs? Okay, so there can be numerous reasons behind executing API testing, and there are a number of tests that can be performed on APIs. Okay, so just to give you an example, any data structure which demands proper validation can be updated by API. In case some interruption arises during the process or any other event is prompted, so you can call another API. Apart from this, test for inputting condition-based return values can also be performed. With the help of these tests, some of the resources can be easily modified, like process killing, an update of the database, and so on. So the return values can also be tested, which can be even null or are with wrong results. So now let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question is, what is the procedure to perform API testing and what exactly needs to be checked? Okay, so during API testing process, a request is raised to the API with the known data. So this way you can analyze the validation response. So basically, things that must be checked during the API testing are, as you can see on the screen, you must check the accuracy of the data, schema validation, HTTP status codes, data type, validations, order and completeness, authorization checks, implementation of response timeout, error codes in case of API returns, and non-functional testing like performance and security testing. So guys, let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question is, what is the test environment of API? So to set up the test environment of API is a bit difficult. So you can say it is a bit complicated and it demands the configuration of the database as well as the server according to the need of the software. So there is no availability of GUI, which is nothing but graphical user interface in this particular form of testing. So once the installation process is over, the API is verified for proper functioning. So during the whole process, API that is invoked by the initial environment is being set up with the distinct parameters to examine the test results. So the next question is, what approach should be followed for API testing? So there are certain factors that determine the API testing approach. So the first step you can see over here is defining the accurate input parameters. Next, verifying the calls of the blend of two or more than two value-added parameters. After that, defining the basic functionality and the scope of the API program. Next, writing suitable API test cases and making use of testing techniques like equivalence class, boundary value, etc. to verify the functionality. Then you test the case execution, and you test the result comparisons with the results expected. And last but not the least, verifying the behavior of the API under conditions like the connection with files and so on. So guys, let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question is a very important question. So the question says, explain the basic difference between API testing and UI level testing. So UI testing means testing the graphical interface. So its focus is basically on the look and feel of the application. So within user interface testing, things like how the user interacts with the app elements such as images, fonts, layout, and so on are checked. If you talk about API testing, so this type of testing allows communicating between two different software systems. So during this testing, a software system that implements an API includes subroutines or functions that can be performed by other software systems. The next question is, name the common protocols that are used in API testing. So guys, as you can see on the screen, there are many protocols that can be used in API testing, such as JMS, REST, HTTP, UDDI, and so. The next question is, name the different tools that are used for API testing. So guys, there are various tools that are available in the market that can be used for API testing, such as Postman, SOAP UI Pro, curl, and alert site API monitoring, and so on. So guys, the next question is an extension to the previous question. So the next question says, what do you mean by SOAP? So the term SOAP refers to Simple Object Access Protocol. So in simple terms, it is an XML-based protocol that helps in exchanging information among different computers. The next question is, what is the procedure to test the APIs? Okay, so for testing the API, there are a few steps that one must follow. So in the first step, you make a selection of the suite that you would like to add to the API test case. In the next step, you choose the test development mode. After that, the development of the test cases for the required API methods are to be selected. After this, you need to configure the control parameters of the application and then the test conditions. So once you're done with all of these steps, then you configure the method validation. And now the next step is execution of the API test. And after this, you can check the test reports and filter the API test cases. Last but not the least, you sequence all of the API test cases and you're done with the procedure, or you can say the number of steps for testing the APIs. The next question is, what do you mean by REST API? So REST API is a set of functions that helps developers in performing requests along with the receiving responses. Through HTTP protocol, interaction is made in REST API. So the term REST refers to representational state transfer. So in a very short span of time, it has become an effective standard for API creation. So guys, let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question is, what are the areas that need to be taken care of while writing the API documents? So the main areas that you need to focus on while writing API documents are, as you can see on the screen, you need to check the source of the content that is available with you. After that, you need to have a plan or sketch of your document, then the delivery layout of the same, or you can say the API documents. After that, the information needed for each of the functions that are available in the document. And last but not the least, you have to focus on automatic document creation programs. So let's move ahead with the next question. And the next question is, what is an API framework? The API framework is pretty easy to understand. So during the process, the config file is used to hold the configurable paths as well as to value the test run. Besides this, within the config file, automated test cases should be represented in the format of a parsable table. So during the process of API testing, it is not mandatory to test each API. As a result, the config file contains some sections whose API is activated for all that specific run. The next question is, what do you mean by input injection? And explain the different ways of doing it. So the term input injection is the act to simulate user input. So user input can be simulated in many different ways, such as direct method invocation with the help of accessibility interface. After that, doing simulation with the help of low-level input, and doing simulation with the help of a device driver. And last but not the least, doing simulation with the help of a robot. The next question is, define the API testing with Runscope. So to test the APIs, we make use of Runscope. So it is basically a web application providing backend services as well as an easy to use interface. The next question is, explain the major challenges that come while API testing. So the list of major challenges that come or that you can face while testing the APIs is parameter combination, parameter selection, and call sequencing. The next question is, what are the main principles of API test design? So there are a few principles that you must follow for API test design. And those principles are, as you can see on the screen, the first principle is setup. So this includes the creation of objects, start services, and initialization of data, and so on. After that, you have execution. So during this principle, there are steps that you must follow for API or scenario as well as logging. The third principle is verification. So for evaluating the execution outcome, there are oracles. Next, you have reporting. So here you keep a tab on the pass, block, or fail. And last but not the least, you have cleanup. So this shows the pre-test state of the application or the API. The next question is, explain the types of bugs that can be found using API testing. So API is capable of finding many types of bugs such as stress, security, duplicate or missing functionality, reliability, unused flags, incompatible error handling, multi-threaded issues, and improper errors. The next question is, name the various tools used for API test automations. So while doing API testing and unit testing, both targeting source code, in case API method is making use of a code based on .NET, then other tools that are providing support must have the .NET. So if you talk about automation tools for API testing, so you have HPUFT, SOAP-UI, JUnit for Java, and NUnit for .NET. The next question is, what is the API documentation? So for any foundation, there is always a need for good documentation. Similarly, API documentation provides a quick reference to access working or a library within a program. While walking through any such documents, a proper plan is a must along with proper sketch or layout for delivery. Apart from this, there is a need for content source information regarding each and every function and so on. So there are various API documentation tools like Deoxygen and Javadoc. Apart from this, you can check the various categories in which each and every function is being documented that are revolving around parameters such as function description, type and syntax of the error message that may occur, syntax, elements, and sequence that is needed for each parameter, and the links regarding functions. So let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question is, list some of the templates for API documentation that are most frequently used. So there are various API documentation templates that are making the whole process really simple and easy. So as you can see on the screen, you have Swagger, Myadot, Slate, FlatDoc, API Blueprint, RESTDoc, Web Service API specification, and so on. The next question is, explain the difference between API testing and unit testing. So while unit testing is a form of white box testing, API testing is a form of black box testing. So unit testing is performed prior to the process of including the code in the build. On the other hand, API testing is done after the build is prepared for testing. In unit testing, the source code is drawn in the form of testing, while in API testing, the source code is not drawn inside. In unit testing, there is a limited scope of testing. As a result, only basic functionalities are measured for the purpose of testing. Apart from this, in API testing, there is a wide scope of testing. Thus, all the issues that are functional are measured for the purpose of testing. And the last point over here is, unit testing is done by the testers, wherein every functionality is separately tested, while the API testing is done by the testers for the purpose of end-to-end testing of the whole functionality. The next question is, define test API. So test API can be explained as the test building blocks library, which is indispensable for testers and developers to create testing tools and automated test suites. The next question is, explain everything about warnings and API errors. So when something is not going as per the expectations, like when the outcome is not as predicted, then the occurrence of errors can be seen and the same warnings are explained in a form of message in a proper format. So within a single module, there can be one or many warnings such as missing module warning, parameter validation warning, and so on. The next question is explain the working of API Builder. So API Builder is a PL SQL utility that includes 4 square files. So to place the API parameters and to begin the technique, only one report is liable. API Builder allows you to create and make use of the API endpoints that can be guzzled by any client application. So there are several components that lead to the making of API Builder. So during the working, files and formed brief tables as well as master bundles for creating the output code. Lastly, the fourth record generates a spooled output of the code into a record relating to the output script. So guys, with this, we have covered the freshest category of questions for API testing. And after this, like from question 26 onwards, we are covering the questions which are most frequently asked for the experienced candidates. So let's move ahead with the next question. So the next question says, what are the benefits of API testing? So there are several benefits of API testing, such as API testing provides application access without the user interface. It provides for easy test maintenance. There is less time taken for resolution. You also have speed and coverage of testing. API testing protects from malicious code and breakage, and this testing is cost effective and it reduces the overall testing cost. And last but not the least, this set of testing is technology independent. The next question is, what are the challenges faced in API testing? So just like other software testing techniques, API testing also faces challenges such as sequencing API calls. Strong coding knowledge is needed for the testers. There is no GUI available to test the application, which makes it difficult while giving the inputs. Apart from this, testers must be aware of the parameter combinations and validations. Exception handling functions are also tested. Apart from this, validating and verifying different systems is difficult for testers. The next question is, explain how to document each function in the API document. So there are a few points to document each function in the API document. The first point is description. So this is nothing but a small description of what a function does. The next point is syntax. So syntax about the parameter of the code, the sequence in which they occur, the required and optional elements, and so on. After that, you have parameters. So parameters are nothing but function parameters. Apart from this, you have error messages. Here, you have the syntax of the error messages. The next point is example code. So here you have a small snippet of the actual code. And last but not the least, you have related links, which is nothing but related functions. So the next question is, what are the tools that are used for API documentation? So there are many free tools that are used for API documentation, such as Redoc, Swagger UI, Dapper Docs, and so on. The next question is, what is the difference between API and web service? So guys, whenever you're asked such kind of questions in the actual interview, so what you can do is, on a piece of paper, you can make two columns, one for API and the other one for the web services. And then in those respective columns, you can mention the points, the differentiating points. Okay, so here in case of API and web service differentiation, so the first point over here is API is a set of protocols and definitions which allow one application to interact with another application. So this is basically the definition of API. And now if you talk about the definition of web service, so a web service is a way for two machines to interact with each other over a particular network. Okay, so the next point in case of API is API can interact through REST, SOAP, curl, and XML RPC calls as well. Also, it can interact through DLL, jar files, XML over HTTP, JSON over HTTP, and so on. And now if you talk about web services, a web service uses three styles for communication, such as SOAP, REST, and XML RPC. So if you talk about APIs, so all APIs are not web services, whereas in case of web services, all web services are basically APIs. The next point is APIs don't need a network for operation, whereas web services always need a network for operations. And the last point over here is API can perform all of the operations which web services cannot perform or achieve. Whereas in case of web services cannot perform all of the tasks that API would perform. So the next question is, what are the architectural styles that are used for creating the web API? So guys, as you can see on the screen, you have HTTP for client server communication. Then you have the stateless communication. Next, you have simple URI as the address for services. And last but not the least, you have XML JSON as a formatting language. The next question is a very important question. So how to perform API testing? So API testing is a type of integration testing that is used to test the API to validate the functionality, performance, and security of the application. So there are a few steps that you must follow to perform the API testing. So the first step over here is discovery testing. So this testing manually executes the set of calls documented in the API. After that, you have the usability testing. So this step verifies whether the API is functional, user-friendly, and does the API integrate with the other platform or not. After that, you have the automated testing. So it comes while creating a set of scripts or a tool to execute the API regularly. After that, you have security testing. So it recommends what authentication type is needed, and it also checks the sensitive data encryption and so on. And last but not the least, you have the documentation. So this is the final phase for a deliverable. So the team makes sure the documentation provides enough data to interact with the API. So let's move ahead with the next question. And the next question says, why is API testing the most preferred for automation testing? So API testing is considered most suitable for automation testing because of reasons such as it effectively verifies all of the functional parts of the system under the test. Then it provides faster feedback. And apart from this, it presents the most stable interface. The next question is, name a few API documentation templates. So there are several API documentation templates that make the entire process simple, leverage the best practices, and they will make the API users satisfied. So as you can see on the screen, you have RESTDoc, RAML, MyDot, Calamum, Swagger, API Blueprint, Web Service, API Specification Doc Template, FlatDoc, and so on. The next question is, what is to be considered to create great API documentation? So there are a few points that you must consider for creating a great API documentation. And those points are, as you can see on the screen, you need to plan your documentation. You must include fundamental sections. After that, you must be consistent and you must avoid jargons. Apart from this, you must include interactive examples and other resources. Next, you must maintain your documentation and you must follow a delivery layout. Apart from this, you must have any information that is needed for every function in the documentation. And last but not the least, you must have automatic document creation programs. So guys, the next question is another very important question. And the question says, what are the differences between SOAP and REST API? Okay, so as discussed earlier, whenever you're asked such questions like differentiate between so and so, so what you can do is create two columns, one for SOAP and the second one for REST API, and just highlight the points in the respective columns. So if you talk about SOAP, so SOAP stands for Simple Object Access Protocol, and REST stands for Representational State Transfer. So SOAP is largely based and uses only HTTP and XML. Whereas if you talk about REST API, so it supports different data formats such as HTML, plain text, JSON, XML, and so on. So, but the most preferred format here is JSON. So if you talk about SOAP, so SOAP is basically a protocol, whereas REST API is basically an architectural pattern. And the last point over here is SOAP uses WS security and SSL, which is nothing but secure socket layer for security. On the other hand, REST API uses SSL and HTTPS for security. The next question is, what is messaging in RESTful Web Services? So RESTful Web Services uses HTTP protocol as a source of communication between the client and the server. So the technique when client sends a message in the form of HTTP request and the server responds in a way of HTTP response is called messaging. So these messages comprise metadata and message data, that is information related to the message itself. So the next question is, what are the main components of an HTTP request? So the main components of HTTP request are action, showing the HTTP methods like put, get, delete, post, and so on. After that, you have URI, which is nothing but Uniform Resource Identifier, which is the identifier for the resource on the server. After that, you have the HTTP version, which represents the HTTP version like HTTP v1.1. After that, you have the request header that is used for carrying the metadata to the HTTP request message. And you have the request body, which describes the resource representation or the message content. The next question is, which HTTP protocols are supported by REST? So guys, as you can see on the screen, these are the protocols that are supported by REST for HTTP, such as GET. So GET requests the data from the defined source. Then you have PUT. So PUT replaces the current representation of the target resource with the requested payload. After that, you have POST. So POST sends data for a server to create or update the resources. So basically, POST requests are never cached or bookmarked. After that, you have options. So this specifies the communication option for the target resources. After that, you have delete. So delete removes the specified resource. And you also have head. So head requests for a response that is similar to the GET request, but without the response body. The next question is, what is URI and what is the purpose of a web-based service and what is its format? So URI is nothing but Uniform Resource Identifier, and this is basically a string of characters that are used for unambiguous identification of resources and extensibility through the URI scheme. So the purpose of this web-based service is to locate a resource on the server hosting. The next question is, define the caching mechanism. So a caching mechanism is a practice to store data temporarily and retrieve data from a high-performance data store, either implicitly or explicitly. So caching mechanism improves performance by copying the asset requested and obtaining the cached copy instead of the original. The next question is, what is the difference between put and post operation in REST API? Okay, so guys, as you can see on the screen, these are the critical differences between put and post. So if you talk about put, the put method is a call when you have to modify a single resource, which is a part of the resource collection. And now if you talk about post, so post method is a call when you have to add a child resource under the resource collection. The put method is idempotent, whereas post method is not idempotent. After that, put is used for update operation, whereas post is used for create operations. So if the put request is used more than once, the results will remain the same. Whereas if a post request is used more than once, so the results will be different. And the last point over here is put works as a specific, whereas post works as an abstract. So the next question is, can we use get requests instead of a put to create a resource? So put or post are used for creating the resources, whereas get is used only for requesting data from a specified resource. The next question is, what is payload in REST API? So the payload in REST API is the actual data that is sent with the get method in HTTP. So it is a crucial information that you must submit to the server when making an API request. So the payload is denoted using curly brackets in a query string, and it can be sent or received in multiple formats. So guys, with this, we have come to the end of this session on API testing interview questions. So here we have tried to cover maximum questions. And if you have any doubts related to this video or related to any particular question, so you can write your doubts and queries in the comment section, and my team is here to help you with resolving all your doubts and queries. So guys, thank you so much for being with us, and I wish you all the best for your upcoming API testing interview, and have a good day.